Good morning. My name is Miss Horn.
And I'm Mr. Berkshire.
Today I'll be teaching about the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark Expedition.
I'll be teaching about the Marbury versus Madison case and the Slave Trade Act. Marbury versus Madison. It established the principle of the judicial review and the power of the federal courts to declare legislative and executive acts unconstitutional. On February 24, 1803, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, decided the landmark case of William Marbury versus James Madison, the Secretary of the United States, and confirmed the legal principle of judicial reviews. This is a continuation of Marbury versus Madison. The meaning of judicial review is to limit congressional power by declaring legislation unconstitutional in the new nation. Marbury versus Madison was arguably the most important court case because it introduced judicial review, the power of federal courts to avoid acts of Congress in conflict with the Constitution. Slave trade legislation. The slave trade legislation, also known as the Slave Trade Act of 1807, was an act of Congress passed in 1800s that made it illegal for Americans to engage in the slave trade acts between nations. This officially took effect in 1808. It was signed by President George Washington. This was the first of several anti-slavery trade acts by Congress. This act created fines up to $100 per enslaved person found on ships.
Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase was in 1803. Thomas Jefferson, who was president, drafted an amendment that would authorize the purchase of Louisiana. It was a land deal between the United States and France. The United States nearly doubled in size when they bought the Louisiana territory.
The country basically stopped at the Mississippi River. France controlled much of the land to the west of this waterway. President Jefferson wanted to acquire the port of New Orleans and what is now the state of Louisiana from the French or France. Its prime location made it a key spot for trade. On to be one of the greatest real estate deals in history, or the Louisiana Purchase, which leads us to the Lewis and Clark Expedition. So basically, Thomas Jefferson, he decided after buying this big, enormous amount of land that he wanted to explore it. So he got the proposed mission, the Voyage of Discovery, and began assembling a team of explorers called the Corps of Discovery. Not the corpse, the Corps. Had to learn it the hard way. So Meriwether Lewis was already, Thomas Jefferson's right-hand man. So he was like, who else would I ask to go on this expedition? Who else would I trust with it? So Thomas Jefferson came to Meriwether Lewis and he was like, I really feel like you'd be the best man for this job. I really want you on this job. And Meriwether Lewis was like, that's great. But I also have a homeboy who would also be great on this job. So he suggested William Clark, and that's how it became the Lewis and Clark Expedition. And that's when they both was like, you know what, this is perfect. Thomas Jefferson was like, I'm about to hook y'all up with some Indian peace medals so that y'all can have some form of trade when y'all, come in contact with the Native Americans. I also want to add how the Spanish were not happy about this. When they found out that Thomas Jefferson was trying to plan this expedition, they were so against it because they felt like, or they thought that they were trying to go after their gold territories. The main purpose for the expedition was to find a water route to the Pacific, which would increase trade opportunities and help solidify an American claim on the far northwest. But the Spanish clearly didn't get that. So the Spanish were so petty, they decided to go out and try to arrest them. So long story short, they were never found. So they were just trying to find, a water route across the country for their business and, trading. I said that again. I'm just trying to make sure, But, while they were doing this, they traveled westward through what is now Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And we'll move on to why they were in North Dakota. So what was back in the day, Knife River Village is now present day North Dakota. And there they met a young woman, or a young Shoshone, Native American woman called Sacagawea. I'm sure you guys have heard of her before. Sacagawea, she was working overtime. She wasn't just being an interpreter. She also helped Lewis and Clark's men get essential supplies. She got them horses. She helped them identify edible plants so they wouldn't, die. herbs, all that. And she prevented hostile relations with other tribes. So, like, hey, they're with me. So long story short, they traveled from 15 to 20 miles a day on foot and by boat toward the mountains. And day after day, they were exhausted. It was freezing. They had to go through the rivers. They barely had food. It wouldn't be a year after they left Missouri, where they came from, St. Missouri, that they would see the Pacific Ocean. So, after their long journey, they finally returned back to Missouri. They had mapped out uncharted land, rivers, and mountains. They had brought back journals filled with details about Native American tribes and scientific notes about plants and animals they'd never seen before. They also brought back stories and tales that made other Americans dream about heading west, which would later lead to the Great Westward Expansion. Well, that is all that I have for y'all today. I hope y'all enjoyed the presentation. I know it was a little all over the place because of my storytelling, but hopefully y'all enjoyed it. Hopefully there are no questions. Please, no questions. I'm just playing. But, all right. Have a nice day. I mean, it had to be an easier way to find it, but I guess, that's how the world evolved and all that. But in the end,